Mr. Ambassador, I appreciate you accepted our request for an interview. So first of all, I would like to thank you for being with Ukraine this challenging month, for being a good advocate for Ukraine in the time of Russian aggression. Let's go down to the questions. And the first question is, could you briefly take a stock on your short stay in Kyiv? Your own rating, your 3 greatest achievements in the positions, and probably 3 failures, if there are any.
So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you today. As you say, this has been fairly short, 6 months or so, 7 actually, and it's been an exciting time. It's been a transition time. I mean, you know, when I arrived, we're getting ready for the parliamentary elections, and the parliamentary elections were decisive. And then the putting together the parliament, putting together the government, beginning the steps on reform, beginning the steps toward the resolution of the Donbass problem, and eventually Crimea. I mean, there's a lot of work that's gone on those. The opportunity to be here is a great one. So I was excited to be here. So I arrived with some turmoil. There was turmoil in the United States. There was transition here, and I think I was able to provide some calming influence on the embassy, some ability to establish good relations between the United States and the new Ukrainian government. Certainly the new president is in office, had good meetings with the president and his team. I think I established the connection between the United States and Ukraine during that time. And then when the parliamentary election took place, we had the opportunity to meet many of the newly elected parliamentarians. We had the opportunity to meet many of the ministers that were appointed to the government, and to get those relationships off on the right foot. I wanted to demonstrate to all the people that I met that the United States is strongly interested in and strongly committed to the success of Ukraine, and that we want to do everything in our power to help Ukraine achieve what the president said he wanted to achieve and what the parliament ran on. That is a successful democracy in the heart of Europe that's moving toward Europe, that is trying to solve the problem of Russian war. And those things, both the reform as well as the resolving the war, getting the Russians out of Donbass, those are the 2 things that I wanted to focus on.
Okay, let me quote you.
Please.
It's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with the political campaign. It's a quote from your opening statement in your testimony this November. It has been referred to the military aid to Ukraine, which is crucial for us. So the question is there in this context any kind of so-called fatigue from Ukraine in the US?
I think not. I think not. I think there, if anything, there is a renewed interest in Ukraine in the United States. Now that's good and bad. I mean, Ukraine, as you say, has been in the headlines in the United States. It's been a topic for the Congress, and Americans and their representatives in Congress know more about Ukraine today than they did 3 or 4 months ago. I mean, they know more about Ukraine, and that's a good thing. They know where Ukraine is. They know that Ukraine is fighting the Russians. They know that Ukraine has a young democracy that has challenges, but it wants to become part of Europe. It wants to join European institutions. It is committed to reform and really to defeat corruption where it stands. So I think those are good things, and I think that the American people want to see Ukraine succeed. I know the Congress wants to see Ukraine succeed. And it's Republicans and Democrats. It's bipartisan.
So you said you believe in Ukraine, and that motivates indeed, especially in the time when some Ukrainians, let me say, are losing the faith in their own country, and your confidence that we Ukrainians can make it out, is it a rational feeling or rather irrational?
It's not irrational. It's not irrational. I believe it's very rational. I look at what Ukrainians say. I listen to what Ukrainians say, and I look at the election campaigns, both the presidential election campaign and the parliamentary election campaign. Even in the parliamentary campaign, there was not a difference among most of the parties about what they wanted Ukraine to do and be and become. The parties, most of the parties, wanted Ukraine to be a solid European country. They wanted, most of the parties wanted Ukraine to join the European Union and join NATO and to defeat corruption and to defeat the Russians, get the Russians out of Donbass. That was across the board, minor exceptions. But the politics of Ukraine, as referenced, as indicated by the elections, demonstrates that Ukraine wants the same kind of things that the United States wants. That is a successful Ukraine. We want to support that.
As a former military officer, as a field officer in Vietnam, and a key person in Reconstruction and Development Office in Iraq during the war in Iraq, would you estimate possible mistakes Ukraine has made while deterring Russian aggression? So
I think it's important for all Ukrainians to see that the people living in Donbass are Ukrainians, and that they will be a part of Ukraine and should be a part of Ukraine when the Russians have left. We've sponsored some informal conversations between people living in occupied Donbass and people living in other parts. And there is not a great difference between those two people, between those two groups. Both groups want to have the war ended on Ukrainian terms. Both groups want to have the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk that are occupied reintegrated, reunited with Ukraine. So I believe that those are important steps that haven't always been the case. It haven't always been the case. And I believe that people are now coming to conclude that Ukraine needs to be whole. Ukraine needs to be united. And when Ukraine is united, it's stronger against the Russians. It's stronger against other problems.
Okay, and you've been to the front line here, I know. And would you tell me, is there anything that U.S. troops, U.S. Army could learn from their Ukrainian colleagues? It's very important for us to know that.
It's very important that the United States Army is working closely with the Ukrainian armed forces and learning lessons. Our Army, the United States Army, is learning from Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian officers, about Russian tactics, about Russian equipment, about the way Russians deploy some of their equipment, the kinds of actions that precede attacks, the understanding of how Russians operate and fight is important for us. We hope we never fight the Russians. But if we do, we want to take advantage of the lessons that Ukrainian military officers and Ukrainian military soldiers have learned. Have to do with the use of drones, have to do with the use of artillery. These are the kind of things that we can think about, we can read about, but Ukrainian military, Ukrainian soldiers have experienced that face-to-face with the Russian military, and that's very valuable for us to learn from.
Would you focus on some specific things in Russian tactics that surprised you much?
So the increased use of both drones is one thing that, since I was in the military, drones are new. And so I've been...
Even in Iraq.
Even in Iraq. That's right. This is a new phenomenon that both sides, both the Ukrainian side and the Russian side, are learning how to use. And the American military is starting to incorporate those lessons in. So that's important. The other big thing is information warfare. And the Russians began that, I think, certainly before the Americans did. And so learning to decipher and to determine what part of the Russian disinformation is out there and how it affects soldiers, it affects civilians, how it affects the press, how it affects people's decisions. That information warfare is a new phenomenon that we need to be able to deal with.
Both chambers of the US Congress have approved a bill on defense budget for the next year, including $300 million to help Ukraine to defend its sovereignty. And we count on many specific systems, really serious systems like anti-ship missiles, which are crucial for us, for our Black Sea shoreline. And the question is it safe to say that the same story would never happen to this portion of aid? I mean, freezing the aid, unfreezing the aid, etc.
So you're exactly right. The Congress overwhelmingly passed the bill that would have the U.S. security assistance to Ukraine increase from $250 million to $300 million. Now that's an authorization, still requires another bill to appropriate the money, but that's a very good indication of the strong support for the Ukrainian military from the U.S. Congress. And you're right, it has components in there, pieces of there, it has training and equipment, but also weapons. The anti-ship weapons the missiles that you mentioned, the counter-battery radar, we've all, for a long time, night vision devices have been very important for Ukrainian soldiers. So more of those. So that's an important piece. And the Congress also was very concerned about any pause or any slowdown or any attempt to hold back any of the security assistance.
To put it on hold.
To put it on hold. So they were very clear to tell the administration and the rest of the world that they intend for Ukraine to get this assistance. And that's why they put it in, and that's what they want to see happen.
Actually, did you participate in discussions over specific defense systems? And if it's so, would you spoil which American weapons are coming to Ukrainian forces in 2020?
So the Ukrainian authorities, the Minister of Defense and his team, are working closely with people in our embassy here to exactly answer that question. What we would like to do is have conversations with the Minister of Defense and his team and the Chief of Defense, the General Komchak, about the kinds of equipment that are going to be necessary. So those conversations are ongoing. The Congress did write in some specific weapon systems, and we've talked about some of those already in terms of surface-to-ship missiles, more drones, more secure communications equipment.
So everything is coming next year?
That continues to come. That's exactly right. Those continue to come. So this will be an important component in order for Ukraine to be able to defend itself against the Russians.
Probably the last question, would you give your perspective to Ukrainian American relationship in 2020?
I think the Ukrainian-American relationship in 2020 is going to get stronger than it even was this year. This year has been characterized by disagreements, by partisanship having to do with allegations of brought on by the whistleblower or of those kinds of impeachment issues. That's a distraction. And Ukraine's not the subject of those conversations. Ukraine kind of is an object of those. It's not the subject. in 2020, next year, Ukraine is going to be the subject. It's going to be how Ukraine moves forward against the Russians, how Ukraine uses this military equipment and military security assistance that is in this bill, how Ukraine moves on economic reform, on anti-corruption measures. It's going to be what Ukraine is doing in its own behalf, but with support from the United States and from Europe. So I think once the controversial stuff where Ukraine is an object gets past us, and it should be past us in January, the rest of the year, people can focus on the Ukraine that is the subject of the sentence and is the subject of moving forward on progress in the direction it wants to go.
So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you for an interview, and as a very pragmatic person, I wish your success will be as a good friend for Ukraine as you were all these challenging months.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's very good to talk to you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be in Ukraine, and I'll be back. I'll be back.